Dorothea Puente was born Dorothea Helen Gray in 1929 in Redlands, California. Her home life, like so many other children born during the time of the Great Depression, was turbulent and difficult. Both of her parents were alcoholics, and her father would often threaten to commit suicide in front of his family, including in front of his children. He would actually die when Dorothea was just 9 years old, not by taking his own life, but from tuberculosis. And during the year that followed his death, her mother lost custody of the children, and then she would also die during a motorcycle accident. Dorothea and her siblings were subsequently left orphaned. Dorothea was sent to an orphanage where she was sexually abused, but she made her way out of the system at the tender age of 16 when she married her first husband. Fred McFowell was a soldier who had just recently returned from fighting in the Second World War. They were married in 1945 and their family quickly started growing. Between 1946 and 1948, the pair would have 2 daughters, but things were not exactly going well for Dorothea. She sent one daughter to live with relatives, placed the other one up for adoption. She suffered a miscarriage, and in late 1948, Fred left her. Later that year, Dorothea was arrested for using forged checks and was sentenced to 4 months in jail with 3 years probation. After she was released, she quickly left town and got busy creating a whole new identity for herself. She began to call herself Tea Singawala Nyarda and claimed that she was a Muslim of both Egyptian and Israeli descent, and within a few years she was married once again. This time to a sailor named Axel Bren Johansen, and she took the frequent periods that he would be at sea to invite men to their home in Sacramento. She would throw parties and gamble away his money, and this, of course, led to a lot of tension between the two. In 1960, Dorothea was arrested for operating a brothel out of their home and was sentenced to 90 days in jail. And in 1961, after a long series of binge drinking, gambling, lying, and suicide attempts, Axel had committed her to the DeWitt State Hospital. It was here that she would get the perhaps not too surprising diagnosis of being a pathological liar with an unstable personality. In 1966, Axel couldn't take it anymore, and he filed for divorce. Dorothea took this opportunity to rebuild herself once again, and she created a whole new image for herself. She started going by the name of Sharon Johansson, and this time she claimed that she was a devout Christian woman. She quickly became known in the community as a kind and charitable person who opened her home to young women who needed help escaping abuse. She wouldn't charge to help these women or even collect rent, and this helped her quickly become a well-known and well-thought-of name in her local community. Approximately 1 year later, Dorothea married again to a man named Roberto Jose Puente, but this marriage would be far shorter than any of her others. Just 16 months later, Dorothea tried to serve Roberto with divorce papers, citing domestic abuse as the main reason behind wanting a divorce, but Roberto fled to Mexico before the divorce could be filed. The couple would legally remain married until 1973, and despite taking out a restraining order against him in 1975, Dorothea would continue to use his surname for another 20 years. It was after this divorce that Dorothea would open a boarding house in Sacramento, renting out rooms in the 16-bedroomed house to those in need. She established herself in her local Hispanic community, and she doubled down on the image of being a kind Christian woman. She opened her doors to alcoholics, to the homeless, and the mentally ill, but this time she would charge them rent and become their unofficial caregiver. She started wearing vintage clothing and big glasses, and she let her hair grow out grey. And then she married again, but this time her husband was gone within the week, and she was single again. In 1978, she was charged with illegally cashing her tenants' social security checks, something she couldn't do because she was not their legal caregiver. She was ordered to pay a $4,000 fine and to serve 4 years probation, but by 1982, Dorothea had a better idea of what she was doing, and she changed her plan. She and a woman named Ruth Monroe officially went into business together, opening the doors to a care house and registering with local social services to provide a home for the mentally ill and the elderly. Local social services were glad to have them and happy to have somewhere where they could house people who desperately needed extra care and supervision. But it didn't take long for things to take a dark turn. Ruth was found dead in the home at the age of 53 after she'd apparently overdosed on medication used to sedate some of their tenants. Dorothea was quick to tell the police that Ruth had taken her own life because her husband was terminally ill, and the police agreed, closing the investigation and leaving Dorothea and her boarding house alone. But just a few weeks later, they were back when a tenant accused Dorothea of drugging him and stealing from him. Dorothea was charged and sentenced to 5 years in jail, and it was during this time that she worked out the kinks in her scheme. She began corresponding with a 77-year-old man from Oregon. His name was Everson Gilmuth, and he would actually drive down to Sacramento to pick her up on the day she was released. The couple soon made plans to marry, but just a few weeks later, after Dorothea had been added to all of his accounts, Everson suddenly became struck down with a mystery illness. Dorothea would often write to his family to keep them updated on how he was doing, but unfortunately he was too sick to write his own letters. She then hired an ex-convict to do some work around her home, and she asked him to build her a box to store some of her things. She then offered him her boyfriend's car instead of cash payment because her boyfriend had gone to Los Angeles and he didn't need it anymore. The worker agreed, and he agreed again when she asked him to help her take a few things to the rubbish tip. It wasn't an official rubbish tip, more like a spot in the neighbourhood near to the river where people would leave their household rubbish, and that storage box that he had built for her was one of the things they left behind that day. A few months later, the badly decomposed remains of an elderly man were found inside that box, but his remains were in terrible condition, and he wouldn't be identified for another 3 years. Dorothea would continue to cash Everson's social security checks, which she could legally do this time because she had been added to his account and his body hadn't been identified yet. So as far as anyone else knew, Everson was sick but alive. Dorothea would continue to write to his family so that they wouldn't become suspicious, and then she set her real plan in motion. She reopened the boarding house and became the caregiver for some of society's most vulnerable people. And she would continue to have work done in and around her home, particularly in her garden. Most of the time she would use a local ex-convict nicknamed Chief, who was happy to get some work, and within 2 years she had taken over 40 tenants. When a tenant named Alvaro Montoya, who was more commonly known as Bert, who suffered from schizophrenia and was developmentally disabled, went missing, his social worker would get an uneasy feeling. She had known him for many years, and she didn't buy the story that he had gone to visit family. She contacted the police when she couldn't get in touch with Bert, no matter how hard she tried, and if it hadn't been for her persistence and that gut feeling, we may never have known what was actually going on inside the boarding house walls. When the police showed up to search the property for Bert, they noticed that most of the garden had been dug up for work, and it didn't take them long to start uncovering human remains. The image that Dorothea had created for herself would really work in her favour here. The police were reluctant to believe that this sweet and kind elderly woman was responsible for the deaths of 7 people that they uncovered in the backyard. They didn't arrest her. In fact, they let her set herself up in a nearby hotel and even let her leave to collect a cup of coffee. But she never came back from this trip. Dorothea subsequently fled to Los Angeles, and it was only when a man she was trying to steal from in a bar recognized her from news reports he'd seen on the television that she was actually caught and arrested. Dorothea was charged with the murders of 9 people, Bert being one of them, Everson another, and her ex-partner, Ruth Monroe. According to the investigators, her victims were overdosed with the drugs that were available in and around the home to help sedate some of the mentally ill tenants, and then Dorothea would wrap up their remains in plastic and bury them in the backyard, continuing to cash in on their social security checks following this. She was able to get her hands on so much sedative because she had been prescribed it by her psychiatrist to help her sleep. She'd even managed to convince him to start prescribing sedatives for Everson because she said that he had been having trouble sleeping as well, and so she had more than enough to go around. The sedative that she was using was particularly toxic when mixed with alcohol and was especially dangerous to the elderly when taken like this. But how did she manage to get away with filling so many prescriptions for sedatives? A witness would later come forward to say that Dorothea had told her that she could get anything and everything she wanted from her psychiatrist because they were sleeping together, but we have to take that with a pinch of salt. Her psychiatrist was cleared of any suspicions when investigators said that they didn't believe that he knew what Dorothea had been using the sedatives for, even though he was aware of her former history and conviction for drugging her former tenants. And we have to take another pinch of salt when we take Dorothea's diagnosis of being a pathological liar. Lying is something that would stick with her for her entire life, including in her personal life. Friends and her local community would struggle to marry the idea of her being a serial killer with the image that she had created for herself, but they did admit that Puente liked to tell stories. She was quoted as telling people that she had been engaged to the Shah of Iran on several occasions, but friends wrote it off as just a harmless story, if maybe a bit of an outlandish one. Even with all of the evidence against her, the image that Dorothea had created for herself was a hard one to shake. The prosecution argued for the death penalty, and the jury would spend months deliberating, and even then couldn't come to a unanimous decision. Finally, she was convicted of 3 out of the 9 murders she was being charged for, and after another jury deadlock in the sentencing phase, Dorothea Puente was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She died behind bars in 2011 at the age of 82 from natural causes, and after living to an age that she'd denied most of her tenants.